Recently, I felt like replaying Resident Evil 4, and while I was doing so, I kept thinking of the remake that released just a couple years ago, and how different the two actually are, despite having the same core essence, so to speak. That got me thinking about remakes in the broader landscape of games as a whole. Some of them seem to be nothing more than shameless cash grabs, some are considered to be complete revitalizations of a game series, and then there's the ones that you feel only exist to make you remember that the original game is sitting in your library collecting dust. I should probably start this off talking about the difference between a remaster and a remake. A remaster is when you're effectively taking a game and polishing the graphics for a re-release, likely because it's on a new console that wasn't available on before. A remake, meanwhile, is taking the concept of a game and completely redoing it for a variety of reasons, which, considering this has been done since the Super Nintendo days, is also for the reason of technology improving vastly, letting people do things that just weren't possible with the original game they had made. Nintendo is fairly guilty of this in a lot of cases, like with Super Mario All-Stars remaking the first 4 Super Mario games. There's also Star Fox Zero being a glorified remake of Star Fox 64, which itself is a remake/reboot of Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, and Metroid Samus Returns being, well, another Metroid 2 remake. Most of these are quite beloved games despite the fact that they are remakes of older games. There are plenty of cases where a remake is a good thing, like those, but also many more where it's completely pointless. Generally, if I'm asking when a game deserves to be remade, besides factoring in the business aspect of things, I usually go by 3 criteria. Firstly, is the game available to be purchased in a legal manner? In other words, can you buy the original game instead to experience something that's considered a classic? Second, how much time has passed since the original game's release, and or how much has game development or technology advanced? If a company or developer is trying to remake something that's been re-released multiple times over, or something that's not even 5 years old, then many people won't be likely to give it the time of day, even with substantial changes. Third, and lastly, how much does the game feel like it's aged? Whether or not something is considered a classic and therefore worth playing, it's just a simple fact that not everyone is going to want to play every kind of gameplay style. Some people enjoy the over-the-shoulder camera perspective, others like a fixed or first-person camera. If the game still controls and generally works well, then just touching up the textures and labeling it a shiny remaster instead of redoing it from the ground up would be preferable for a lot of people, especially if it's just being done for the sake of profit. Under these criteria, things like the Resident Evil remakes or Crash Bandicoot and Sane trilogy could very easily be seen as justified, while other things like The Last of Us getting a remake seems rather pointless, considering that didn't change nearly as much as something like the Resident Evil 2 remake changed, for better or for worse. I'm going to talk about these two as examples of when remakes are and are not justified, starting with the remake of Resident Evil 4. But first, a bit of a history lesson. Now, there was a strange sense of contention around the remake of RE4 specifically, considering that game was, in a way, the one that started it all, at least as far as putting the traditional third-person camera control scheme on the map. Before Resident Evil 4, all of the Resident Evil games used tank controls in confined environments where the camera angle was fixed in place, but with the advent of 4, despite the game still having tank controls, now the camera was positioned over the shoulder and you could do so much more with it. Even back in 2002, people were wondering what it would be like for Resident Evil 2 and 3 to get this same treatment with the remake of the original Resident Evil on the GameCube. Despite that, it wouldn't be until 2019, over 20 years after the original release of Resident Evil 2, that Capcom finally gave us an answer to that with the Resident Evil 2 remake, one of my favorite games of all time, and the game that made me a fan of the series alongside 7, but I could talk about my history with the series another time. Point is, I did everything the Resident Evil 2 remake had to offer, to the point where I have almost all the puzzles memorized and regularly clear the game in under 3 hours. When I did a playthrough of this just to show a friend the story and all that, I decided to do second scenario with Claire, and did it in minimalist, which means no item box, just because I'd replayed the game that much. The only thing I didn't bother with at the time was Ghost Survivor stuff, which was added in later, which was not fun to go through. This extra mode just emphasized the anti-fun aspects that would be unfortunately expanded upon in the remake of Resident Evil 3. Did Resident Evil 3 deserve a remake? Absolutely. Is the remake itself not actually a good remake, though? Also, yes. But getting back on track, both Resident Evil 2 and 3 have now gotten the over-the-shoulder camera from 4 as well as updated controls, and for the most part, fans were pretty happy at the time. About a year after the release of Resident Evil Village, which was only a year after the remake of Resident Evil 3 was released, a remake of Resident Evil 4 would be announced to much skepticism, with the main point against remaking 4 being that the original was still easily playable today and was still a good game regardless. Now, in a post-Resident Evil 4 remake world, I decided to go back and play the original Resident Evil 4 and see how it really held up, and to be entirely honest, while the game deserves the accolades it got, it certainly feels like a game that's over 20 years old. It's no secret that Resident Evil 4 went through a tumultuous development cycle back in the early 2000s, which a lot of people know if you've been on the internet at all. After all, the first draft of Resident Evil 4 is what eventually became the Devil May Cry series, and then after that there were another 2 versions before we finally landed on what we got as the final product. This was on top of it being a Nintendo GameCube exclusive for all of 1 year before being ported to the PlayStation 2 and then later getting an HD remaster that was put on every single console you can think of. I even have a physical copy of this for my PS4, so I was also initially confused as to why Capcom would remake this besides money. Then the remake itself actually came out, and I cannot tell you just how much time I put into this game, so instead I'll show you my save file and the fact that I unlocked everything that you possibly could, including those annoying gachapon charms for the attaché case, which took way more loops of the shooting gallery than you'd think. Really, look at this attempt I made during recording and tell me this wasn't when I was grinding for those tokens. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Anyway, back to the original point. Despite how large amount of people felt, the remake of Resident Evil 4 was fantastic at delivering the experience of the original game in a much more focused and also equally enjoyable manner, but also made me take off the rose-tinted glasses I had for the original game in a way. Don't get me wrong, Resident Evil 4 is still a classic and a testament to innovating gameplay mechanics, but actually playing it in the modern day is another story. I did finish it in professional mode, no less, but doing so made me really understand why Capcom wanted to remake this game besides the sake of money. Going through a few things that really stood out to me. The water hall was handled much better in the remake, making things much more streamlined than in the original, where it was basically just standing in a room and praying you didn't get overwhelmed by the seemingly endless enemies, only made worse by how fragile Ashley can be at that point of the game. There's also the layout of the castle itself, where progressing felt like you were doing far more backtracking and detouring than you really needed to do to get to where you needed to go, like the Chimera Lock, this being at the entrance of the castle just to lead to a ride to get you almost right back where you were only a couple minutes ago. That felt so unnecessarily obtuse. There's also other things that were moved elsewhere to better justify them, namely the not ski lift and laser hall sequence, both of which were moved to separate ways in the remake, or things that were removed entirely, like this extremely bizarre lava room. Why is this here? Why do Leon and the Ganados not care about the heat or the fact that it's clearly just orange food coloring in the water passed off as lava? Don't worry about it. There's nothing like this in the game again. Which, in retrospect, just makes this part even weirder. There are a lot of aspects in the remake that give you a reason to do things that were also available to be done in the original, but you had little to no reason to explore these areas, like the house you find Luisa in being the same one you can get introduced to the parasite dogs after defeating Del Lago. Except in the remake, there's a treasure that you can find here to give you a reason to come back, rather than a cool thing you read in a Game Informer magazine. Man, if you remember Game Informer, you deserve a veteran's discount. There's other things that were just polished and made better as well, like most of the fight with Krauser, where it feels like you're actually able to engage with the game's mechanics fairly, instead of being punished for trying to engage with the game's mechanics. I pressed the QTE and I got killed for it so many times that I actually just stopped engaging with them, and that's how I won the fight. That's so backwards. And to be fair to the game, I was using the Dipman glitch that made me move 1.5 times faster, but even without that, this fight really does not work the way the game intends it to. So, in short, despite all skepticism, Resident Evil 4 did deserve a remake, and it helps that it was really good. The other thing the remake helped with was removing the nostalgia, blinding me to the game's flaws because of just how influential the original really was. In terms of the criteria I mentioned earlier, it even fits into 2 of those 3 very neatly, the only one it goes against being the accessibility point, considering just how many systems the original game's been ported to. Plus, it helps that Resident Evil 4 is just a fantastic game. Both times, in fact. On the other side of the fence, there's games like The Last of Us Part 1, which everyone can agree doesn't have any good reason to exist. For those that weren't there all of 9 years ago, when this game was all over YouTube and your favorite YouTuber Markiplier or PewDiePie was playing it, The Last of Us is a primarily narrative-driven game, essentially spearheading the games as cinema archetype, following the story of Joel and Ellie and their ramshack father-daughter relationship in a not-zombie apocalypse. Much of the gameplay involved walking over-the-shoulder shooting mechanics and crafting things to get past a complicated layout, whenever you weren't watching cutscenes. These are things that were becoming more and more common at the time it was released, and the game did control very well. Though considering the gameplay was secondary to the narrative, most people didn't really mind it that much when it didn't work properly. Released on the PS3 back in 2013, the game was received very positively, getting a remaster only 1 year later to pretty up the graphics a bit on the PS4, since it was pretty late in the PS3's lifecycle. Given how positively the game was received, Naughty Dog started work on a sequel as soon as possible, but considering Part 2 took 6 years after the remaster to be released, yeah, it went through development hell, to put it very mildly. Though once Part 2 was released, Naughty Dog focused on remakes and remasters at this point, replaying their greatest hits of only one console generation ago, with Uncharted collections and remaking The Last of Us for PS5. Even though The Last of Us had gotten an update for the 8th console generation via the remaster and could have just as easily been re-released, Naughty Dog went ahead with it anyway, to the dismay or confusion of a lot of people, which only got worse once the remake actually released. Doubly so if you got a PC copy. Now, yes, The Last of Us 2 did change some aspects of the gameplay compared to the first game and added a number of quality of life improvements. But was that enough to justify remaking the first game as a whole? For a lot of people, especially fans of the series, the answer to that question was no. Being fair to it and using the criteria I mentioned earlier, let's run through them. The time difference between the original and remake wasn't even a decade, so the game wasn't really old enough to justify remaking instead of remastering. The original was quite literally remastered for the PS4 a year after release, so availability also wasn't an issue unless you were on PC, and the game wasn't changed substantially enough to warrant remaking it from the ground up, on top of the fact that the game was released for the PS3 and already felt like a modern game. And for those of you that might say PS3 games should get remakes anyway, I just want to point you to Devil May Cry 4. This game was released for the PS3 and Xbox 360, and still looks just as good, if not better, than a good majority of PS5 games. In almost every respect besides removing PlayStation exclusivity, The Last of Us did not need to be remade for anything besides money. Thus, given how little justification The Last of Us Part 1 really had to be made, and the fact that you got everything from The Last of Us that you really needed from the original game, or in the current day, the TV show adaptation, the remake of The Last of Us didn't even sell half the amount that the original and remaster did, only moving about 2 million copies compared to the 12 and 18 million of the original and remaster respectively. Does this mean remakes are going to stop? Of course not. There's already a remake of the first Halo game that was announced last year, and even though I have a feeling that's more of an excuse to get the team familiar with how a new engine works, the game does technically fit the criteria I have, save for the availability part, considering the Master Chief Collection is readily available on everything except PlayStation. The last remnant of the console wars disappearing before our very eyes. Man, I feel old. Now, there are points where it feels like games are purely being remade for the sake of money, but even games that are the most influential do deserve a shot to be refined and given new life, although giving the customer the choice between both and letting them choose their own preference isn't bad for anyone. As beloved as the 2002 remake of Resident Evil is, I think it's also fair to want a remake of that game to bring it more in line with the more recent adaptations of the series, even if I think an entry like Code Veronica needs it more urgently. Actually, that's the best way to describe a remake. It's like an adaptation. You might not agree with everything that was done. Some people still prefer the more action hero type Leon in the original RE4 compared to the traumatic survivor of the remake as the most obvious example. But when you distance yourself from the nostalgic emotion of it, you can understand why it's done. The most prominent example of something like this that extends beyond video games is The Lord of the Rings. The films and books are completely different mediums, and both can be enjoyed in very different aspects, despite the movies being far more popular and much easier to digest. When a remake is justified and works, it can be treated in a similar way to that. Although it certainly helps in the case of Lord of the Rings that both versions are readily available. I wish I could say the same for the original Resident Evil 2 and 3 to let people choose which one they think is better, but that's a Capcom decision to make. At the end of the day, remakes aren't always there just for the sake of making money. There's benefits for both the developer and consumer side of things, especially when it's done well. There's many games that deserve a second chance, like Devil May Cry 1 and 2, or beloved RPGs like Shin Megami Tensei, despite how greedy Atlus can be with their DLC practices. But even in the sea of remakes that it feels like we can be in, I'm not going to deny that they have their place. Besides, when something gets the second shot it deserves, I don't think anyone can complain. With that said, thank you guys for watching, and I hope you take care. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go back to playing Resident Evil 4 Remake in anticipation for Requiem.